from Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, glad to have you with us. Coming up, K-State's Dan O'Brien will talk about signs of improvement in the ethanol sector and about ongoing favorable basis bids at local grain delivery points around Kansas. Those are featured topics during Dan's weekly segment on the grain market trends. Then K-State's Gregg Ibendahl reports on a new analysis out of K-State, which estimates net farm income in Kansas for 2020, and it projects a steep drop in the returns to crop and livestock production for this current year. Gregg will have the particulars. Further ahead, on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp rejoins us, plus much more next on this Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Welcome once again. For our grain market segment this week, as usual, we turn to Dan O'Brien, who is based out in Colby, northwest Kansas, as K-State Research and Extension's grain market economist, for an overview of what's happening in the grain trades. Dan, let's begin with this because it's been an ongoing sore spot in the markets because of the difficulties ongoing in the ethanol industry. You say there are subtle signs of recovery for that industry.
Yes, when you look at the weekly U.S. Energy Information Agency reports, we have seen some recovery, some bounce back in U.S. ethanol production. Not all the way to where we were prior to the COVID-19 issues hit so harshly in April, but we're starting to recover some to the degree that people are anticipating the U.S. economy it's more acceptable now to be optimistic about the economy doing better, motor fuel demand improving some. Most of the discussion I hear is, do we get back to 90% of what we had or 95%, et cetera, something like that. So as ethanol production recovers, you see corn usage improving and it mitigates or makes less worrisome the potential for 1 billion or more of less corn usage in ethanol. Now at latest numbers you look at, say 300, 400 million bushels. Still, that's not desirable, but it's a lot better than 1 billion plus. So it gives us more hope in the feed grain markets, corn in particular. So as you see the change in profitability, it was interesting to me that when you look at the month of April, we had signals early in that month that ethanol plant managers, the folks in that industry looked at, and they saw a terrible outcome. And so they closed down near half of the U.S. capacity, about 45%, 40, something like that. So you had a draconian response. But then when you look at the weekly prices throughout the month, for the month of April, you end up and have about 20 cents, 25 cents per gallon loss in those plants. And that's not that dissimilar from where we'd seen in a few months prior to that. So it looks like that the ethanol plants saw what was happening, responded with the cutbacks, and they were painful. A lot of people laid off, facilities slowed down, or at least slowed down if not stopped. But then their quick response contributed towards righting the ship. So there you go in terms of seeing what happens when independent companies have had the ability to respond quickly. They basically mitigated the downside. So April, a loss of 20, 25 cents a gallon. Come into May so far, from May 1 to May 22nd, at least by the models that we're using, we're still losing money, but instead of 20, 25 cents, it's more like 12, 13, 14, 15 cents. And we had operated quite a period of time with going at basically full capacity, several months, going all the way into last fall at about that level. So that the more efficient plants, that didn't have debt overhead, et cetera. They were just chugging right along. Wish they were making more money, but they were still covering costs going forward. So now from April to March, it seems to we've mitigated some of the downside, and that was happening in the ethanol industry. And this is great news for the corn market. Mm-hmm. And I think you see that in the latest basis bids out of ethanol plants. The cash price offered for corn in Kansas, $305 to about $337.5. Basis of 14 under to 18 over the July contract. Even grain sorghum on the low side from 319.5 to 324.5. Basis even to positive 5 cents. And those are tremendous bids. Tremendous basis bids anyway.
The best in some time, right?
Well, yes. Now we are seeing at some export-oriented locations for grain sorghum, we hear of way better bids than that. Tremendous positive bids for grain sorghum. In fact, just take a look at that. In Topeka for sorghum, a bid of 45 over, 30 over in Concordia, 55 over in Salina, top end 49 over in Hutchinson, 25 to 30 over. So the export demand pull on sorghum is showing up in the basis, positive basis over July, really tremendous relative prices. They only wish that the futures were higher, So you look at that basis bid for grain sorghum at ethanol plants at 5 over, it has to get there to keep up if they want any grain sorghum to come in, because the export-oriented market is moving well. So to me, I think if we really want to see what's going on, where the profitability is at, so often you kind of scour through the basis data and you can see where the demand pull is at. And right now we do see positive export movement for sorghum. Hopefully U.S.-China relations can continue with all that's happening between Hong Kong and other issues, mainly Hong Kong right now, military challenges here and there. You hope that U.S. and China exports don't get derailed. It would be a hard shot at the grain sorghum industry right now, which is, again, seeing very positive news.
And repercussions potentially for the soybean sector as well, which we'll come back to. But since we're on the topic of basis, it's not just feed grain basis that's doing well. You say we look at the other grains in Kansas, they are showing a friendly basis trend likewise.
In picking out various key locations in the state and looking at Colby, Cornerstone Ag, Salina, Cargill, Columbus, Farmers Co-op, and looking at their basis bids basically pulled off of what they're reporting publicly on places like DTN. In all three of those locations for soybeans, we have the best basis that we've seen in since 2016 right now. For wheat, we have basically either the highest or the second highest basis bid we've seen for this time, again, about week 20 of the calendar year. As we've seen again since 2016, we're either at or, I guess the best basis bids that we've been comparing that against that have been so far last year, 2019, as the market was moving higher. So underlying demand, underlying positives on wheat as well. And again, we just talked about how corn and grain sorghum, particularly grain sorghum basis, just, for a while there, it was moving up at something akin to a 45-degree pattern moving to the higher side. So that's indicative of, folks are coming into the market. It's time to buy, and you were seeing it in the basis bids.
Well, two further things here, Dan. On the wheat trade, concerns over dry weather nearing harvest time here in the Central Plains are starting to carry some weight in the market, you think?
Yes, and I know we've had a virtual wheat plot tour going on the last couple nights, and been very informative, without question. Still, that shows where we're at right now, and as wrestled through some freeze damage from earlier, et cetera, dry conditions, parts of the state, particularly Southwest, and now we have a forecast for the next X number of days. Is it 7-10 days of some very high temperatures, and 84% of the Kansas wheat crop as of basically coming into Monday was headed, and more now. Well, gosh, high temps right when we've heading towards fill. That just seems to be, to me, a vulnerable time. And the wheat markets yesterday, what they do, they, in response to those forecasts, up 12.25 cents on the lead contract. So some concerns. High temps they don't help yield much. They have been known to help give us higher proteins, but there's a balance between the number of bushels and the price you get on quality basis for the wheat crop. So I guess, Eric, we'll be watching this, as will all of our agronomic and industry friends and colleagues around the state, to see what transpires in the next couple of weeks. But it seems to be kind of a risky time right now for wheat production in Kansas as we look to what these high temps might do. And as you referred to earlier, the rhetoric has been flying between the U.S. and China over at least a couple of things, one being who's responsible for the COVID situation, the other being the political issues surrounding how Hong Kong is being overseen by China. Will this be a hindrance to soybean sales to China? It does seem that info that we're getting out of the market is that China's still slugging its business into Brazil largely, even though the price in Brazil is higher by $5 to $10 per unit than it is coming out of the U.S. The U.S. dollar has weakened some here of late. Even with that, in the week ending May the 21st, we see 12.2 million bushels of exports need a pace of 27, 28 to meet the USDA's projection. So it would seem to be with price advantage U.S. and net cost advantage U.S., we'd be seeing more exports. So if you're a buyer operating in China and you're worried about what potential political repercussions there could be down the road, you probably still keep buying from the, quote, non-political source. Again, growers, Dan posts detailed weekly analysis of the grain trades on the agmanager.info website for your consideration at agmanager.info. Have a look. And Dan, many thanks. Enjoy the weekend. Thanks, Eric. Take care. Our weekly visit with K-State Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien there. And we'll return shortly with more on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Well, it's been a turn of events for the ages, the coronavirus situation, and there's little argument that it has adversely impacted the Kansas agricultural economy, and that is an integral part of a new report out of the Agricultural Economics Department at Kansas State University. It's a preliminary estimate of 2020 Kansas net farm income. Several contributors to this article, among them Gregg Ibendahl. Gregg is a farm management economist with K-State Research and Extension. Gregg, this comes on the heels of the just freshly released 2019 net farm income summary from the Kansas Farm Management Association. So that is serving as something of a reference point for these projections that you put together?
Yeah, with the whole coronavirus going on right now, there's been a lot of interest of what might happen in this coming year as far as net farm income. I should point out, though, first of all, this isn't strictly a coronavirus effect, our net farm income, because what we're really doing is we're comparing 2019 to what we project for 2020. And given that we're starting with the 2019 as a baseline, that may be a little different than actually looking at what the coronavirus would actually do, because to do that kind of analysis, you would really have to start from what you would expect it happen in 2020 without a virus compared to what is happening and go from that route. But I think will give producers a good idea of what's going to happen in this coming year.
So it's a broad context that we're looking at here. And just to remind what that 2019 net farm income summary had to say about the average net income in Kansas, that's where we start with this comparison, right?
Yeah, and really you got to almost go look at that in really two pieces. So our average net farm income, if you look at our KFMA state summary, we had a average net farm income last year of $110,000 per farm, which is really the fourth straight year seeing an income increase. But really, a lot of that income last year came from these extra special market facilitation program payments. And those amounted to about $60,000 per farm. So you take those away, and again, we don't really expect those to happen in 2020. You take those away, we're probably looking at a baseline starting of about, around $50,000 or so.
How did you and your associates in agricultural economics go about coming up with these projections? What methods did you follow here?
Well, we have to first look at, obviously, revenue declines. And as you might guess, the virus has done a bad thing for all kinds of prices that farmers receive, both on the grain and livestock side. So those are all going to be down. And then we made an estimation of what would happen to the expenses. And again, there may be a little bit of good news on that side because a lot of our expenses are going to be lower, especially on the fertilizer and on the fuel side. And then we also have to adjust for government payments. Now, the one good thing about the regular government payments is that, they kick in with higher payments when prices tend to go down, like what we're seeing here. So we expect some benefit from that. And then also on the crop insurance side, we're going to probably see higher payments from there as well. So those things kind of all counterbalance, and we kind of weighed those out on a line item by line item basis to get our net farm income projection for this year.
And we'll get right to that number here. It's striking that if all holds as you're projecting it will, we will see a substantial drop in net farm income in Kansas over the course of 2020.
Yeah, now also keep in mind, we did this initial analysis without looking at these special COVID payments that they just talked about here. So that's going to offset this to some degree. Those just came out, were announced when we first put this analysis together. So we let those off for the moment here. So just looking at what we expect the average net farm income for all farm types across Kansas, we expect the net farm income to fall to about $14,000, which would be a drop of between 87 and 70%, depending on whether you're looking at the MFP payment in there or not. As you might have guessed, livestock producers are going to fare much worse. We're looking at their net farm income falling from about $36,000 to a negative $15,000, which would be a decline of 142%.
Wow. So again, anywhere from an 87% drop broadly to, for livestock producers, 142% drop into negative territory. By the way, we'll be picking up on the livestock side of this in the conversation with your colleague Glenn Tonzer on Monday's broadcast. But let's look at the grain side more closely and what things jump out to you in as far as the anticipated impacts here, Greg.
Well, really, when you look at the overall revenue for grain side and then consider what might happen with government payments and crop insurance, so grain producers are going to certainly take a hit. But, luckily we have these safety nets, especially for the grain producers, to kind of mitigate that to some degree. So it's not quite as bad as what you first thought. We're looking at corn prices declining by 16%, soybeans by 12%. Wheat is not quite as bad. It's only been about a 1%. Grain sorghum by 2%. So there's certainly going to be a drop on the grain revenue side, but it's not going to be near as much as the livestock side.
Yeah. Crop insurance, how much relief will that offer, according to your analysis?
Well, for crop insurance, that was a little tough. That was probably the hardest number here to actually figure out, because when we look at 2019, we had about 3% of our acres were paid on this preventive planting stuff, and nationwide that was really a big payout. I think nationwide there was like 20 million acres that qualify for that preventive planting number here, and that was by far in a record twice what it had been before. So those numbers are likely to be lower this year. We can't say never yet, depending on what happens. So those numbers will likely be lower, but offsetting that is we're likely have higher payments because prices in these crop revenue coverage contracts are going to be more. When these prices were set for these contracts back in January, February, the price at the time seemed kind of low, but now looking back at it, that price in those crop revenue things is actually pretty good compared to what it is now. So I think there's a higher likelihood that we will see a higher government payment from the crop insurance side of things, which would overall increase our crop insurance number. I'm estimating about 10%, but that's kind of a seat of the pants estimate. That's probably the number I feel least confident about in my estimate.
You mentioned the standard government payments, price loss coverage, or the ARC payment if producers went that route with their participation. Once more, it's the same question in general. How much of an economic padding will that provide in the wake of these negative numbers?
I think it will be at least double when you, in fact, take out the MFP payment. So we're looking at probably about, number probably close to $40,000 this year. Producers, this is usually they get to make a new choice for that. They could see what was going to happen clear with this choice for this year, which made it, I think we're going to have a pretty good year for government payments for that. So most producers chose the PLC option for practically every one of their crop bases except for the soybeans, maybe in the southeast part of the state, because the PLC payment looks like it's going to pay off pretty well, especially the payment on the wheat basis should be pretty good this year. Grain sorghum base will also turn out to be pretty good. As of the April estimate that Rich Llewellyn and Art Barnaby put out, we were looking at a PLC payment of 88 cents a bushel for wheat and 77 cents for grain sorghum, 7 cents for corn, and no payment for the soybean base. So when you factor all those in, we're looking at a government payment number probably twice of what we had last year.
As you mentioned earlier, Greg, if there is an upside here, and it's really hard to ferret that out, but crop production expenses will be, well, at least under control, if not favorable for producers.
Yeah, I think at the very worst, you could say I think most expenses will be at least even what they were last year. The places where I do see declines are going to be on the diesel side and the fertilizer side. I have a model somewhere in Ag Manager that talks about pricing fertilizer as a function of the oil price and the corn futures price. If I look at that, potentially we could see nitrogen fertilizer prices decline by 24% over the course of the year, with diesel prices declining up to 20% for the course of the year. Now, the only problem with that is that farmers probably paid for a lot of their fertilizer either the end of last year or the beginning of this year before things started going bad here. So I don't think they're going to see all those benefits show up this year. I was looking at maybe half of the potential decline in fertilizer and half the decline in diesel show up this year. The one good thing is, though, I think prices going into 2021, though, should be very nice. Again, that's a year away, but again, that it could be something. One positive is that 21 prices should definitely be lower.
There is much more detail, obviously, to this report, and we're inviting producers to have a look at the full write-up on agmanager.info. But these are rough times ahead for agricultural producers in general. An 87% reduction in average net farm income speaks volumes here. Long term, though, as we look at other financial fundamentals like equity, debt status, land values, all is not lost here, is it?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, land values have kind of been holding steady. Debt's been increasing a little bit every year, but nothing too dramatic anyway, although that's certainly something to keep an eye on going forward here. So I think we're in pretty good financial shape going into this. Hopefully this coronavirus thing will just be a 1 year temporary thing. We can kind of bounce back to what we were maybe expecting before this whole thing started here. So again, let's just hope it is just a short-term 1 year hit to our net farm income this year.
Indeed. Once again, this has been freshly posted by the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State. It's a preliminary estimate of 2020 Kansas net farm income. Have a look at agmanager.info. Greg, thanks for sharing the word from this document, and we'll talk again soon.
All right, thanks.
Gregg Ibendahl, farm management economist, K-State Research and Extension, with us on this segment of Agriculture Today, and we'll return in a few moments on the K-State Radio Network.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Now in our 96th year of broadcast service to agriculture in Kansas and the Central Plains, this is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. On now to today's agricultural news headlines. These courtesy in part of DTN. According to a report from Reuters out today, China has pressed ahead with national security legislation for Hong Kong, and President Trump has vowed a tough response and will hold a news conference on China later today. Sources said that if the president announces tough sanctions on Beijing, that China will probably reduce its buying of U.S. agricultural products. If the measures are mild, trade may not be affected, the source added. Under their initial Phase 1 trade deal reached in January, China committed to buying a $32 billion worth of U.S. agricultural products over 2 years, above a baseline based on 2017 figures, that is. Now, China has already purchased some U.S. soybeans and corn in several rounds of purchases this year, but the typical peak period for Chinese purchases of U.S. crops would come after the harvest in the fall, and those purchases could be in doubt now. According to a senior Asia commodity analyst at broker FC Stone, Darren Fredericks, the tensions between the U.S. and China mean that private companies are less inclined to buy American products. Crush margins for American shipments after September are increasingly economical for crushers compared with rival supplier Brazil as the U.S. harvest approaches, according to several traders. Meantime, record harvests of wheat and corn will drive grain production to an all-time high in 2020-21 and push global stockpiles higher for the first time in 4 seasons. This according to the International Grains Council, as they released their monthly report yesterday. The IGC raised its production and carryover stocks forecast for 2021 while cutting its consumption forecasts. The intergovernmental body now expects total grain production of 2.2 billion metric tons, an all-time high, thanks to record wheat and corn harvests. The forecast for 12 million tons higher than the previous estimate given in April, and it compares with an expected output of 2.1 billion tons for the current season. That rise, along with a cut in the IGC's forecast for grain consumption in 2021, means that the IGC has raised its forecast for grain stockpiles by 10 million tons to 627 million tons, and that would mark the first rise in stocks in 4 seasons, according to the IGC report. And Democrats on the Senate Agriculture Committee released a bill this week which outlines what they want in the next COVID-19 aid plan. The Food Supply Protection Act would provide $5.5 billion in grants, loans, and loan guarantees to help small and medium-sized companies shift their operations to respond to COVID, including procuring more personal protective equipment and testing. The proposal includes $1 billion for grants to help food banks and other nonprofits boost their capacity to handle food, and $1.5 billion for more surplus food purchases, including a new clearinghouse to help connect excess products with groups that need it. Quoting here Senator Debbie Stabenow, who is the ranking member of the Senate Agriculture Committee, the COVID-19 crisis has tested the strength of our nation's food supply chain, creating a ripple effect that's harming our families, our farmers, and our workers. Coming your way next, this week's edition of the Kansas Wheat Scoop. And for that, we turn to Marcia Boswell. Marcia?
K-State Research and Extension hosted virtual wheat field days on May 27th and 28th. These events were held live on YouTube and allowed participants to learn about the latest developments in the Kansas wheat crop conditions, diseases, variety selection, and agronomic research. The first evening focused on how to choose varieties and a look at 2020 wheat diseases. Speakers were Romulo Lolato, Extension Wheat Specialist, Eric DeWolf, Plant Pathologist, Lucas Haig, Northwest Area Agronomist, and Kelsey Anderson, Wheat Disease Specialist. Lolato began with an update on the current wheat crop and what he has seen around the state so far. The combination of drought conditions and an April 13th freeze event have really hurt the wheat crop this year. However, with recent moisture over the past couple weeks, the potential of the crop could still result in decent yields. He then discussed traits to look for when choosing a wheat variety to plant. He also suggested that farmers should take a look at how a potential variety performed in local trials. DeWolf gave an update on the diseases that the 2020 wheat crop is facing. Most importantly, stripe rust is emerging as a potential threat to our Kansas wheat crop. Farmers should be aware of what's going on and see which varieties are holding up to the stripe rust. He also talked about septoria leaf blotch, leaf rust, and wheat streak mosaic virus, stating that it looks like it's going to be a lower than average year for wheat streak mosaic. Not only should farmers try to pick varieties that are going to have a good yield record, but also look for overall disease package. He says things to be watching for are continued adaptation of stripe rust, possible emergence of leaf rust late in the season, and risk of fusarium head blight. Haig stated that when choosing a variety for western Kansas, the first question to ask is whether you are willing to spray a fungicide. If you are, there are more varieties to choose from. He also recommends balancing proven variety performance with rapid introduction of new varieties, and says to look at a diversified portfolio approach, stating that planting 3 to 5 varieties is a good goal to reduce risk. The second evening featured updates from the K-State wheat breeders. Alan Fritz discussed the Manhattan breeding program, which focuses on central Kansas. Gorong Zhang talked about the varieties in the Hayes breeding program for western Kansas. Stu Duncan of the Northeast Area Extension Office gave tips for selecting varieties in central Kansas. And finally, Aaron Harries, Kansas Wheat's VP of Research and Operations, talked about research projects that are funded by Kansas wheat farmers through the Kansas Wheat Commission's 2-penny wheat assessment. To watch the recordings from these events and learn more about the K-State wheat varieties coming down the pipeline, visit our website at kswheat.com. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. And a quick calendar item ahead of the break for you beef cattle producers. K-State Research and Extension will be hosting a special webinar on management decisions in light of the weather patterns, the flooding and the drought, and calf market volatility following COVID-19. That webinar is set for next Thursday, June the 4th at noon, and it'll feature the University Beef Extension Team and K-State's Mary Knapp. To register for that webinar, go to ksubeef.org, ksubeef.org. And speaking of Mary Knapp, she's next here on Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, Kansas agricultural weather and the latest observations from Mary Knapp, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension. The rain summary for the past week, Mary, we'll begin with that. And yes, it was a damp week across a fair part of Kansas, including locations really eager to see it.
Right. Probably the area that was most interested in having the additional rainfall was the western third of the state. And they did see some fairly decent rains. They averaged an inch or better in most of the divisions. The West Central was only 86/100ths of an inch on average, but all of them were above normal for the week, which is the first time since probably December that we've seen above normal consistently across the region. The unfortunate thing is that it may be too little too late for the winter wheat, but at least we got some in there. As you go to the central areas of the state, again, above average, just about an inch and a half in the south central to almost 2 3/4 inches in the central division. Again, above average for all the divisions. There, the north central area is likely to benefit the most from that additional rainfall for the winter wheat. The wheat was not quite as far advanced in most cases, and so it can take advantage of that rainfall. For the central and south central, it's going to be more for the summer row crops that we've added to the soil profile in there. Move to the eastern divisions, and not so desirable for the above normal rainfall, particularly the southeast, where they're facing one of the wettest starts to their year. There was flooding again. The southeast division averaged 2.40 inches, which is not quite 2 times their normal for the week, but certainly well up there. Northeast was a little bit drier than the Southeast. They saw an average just under 2.5 inches, and that's, again, almost 2.25 times what you normally would see. That was a little bit more welcome because we were beginning to see some of that abnormally dry conditions develop in the region, and that has been pushed out by those rains.
But to emphasize how wet it is in southeast Kansas, you have a total from colleagues out of K-State located down there that paint the picture very clearly.
Yes, down at Parsons, they, as of Wednesday, had just a shade under 30 inches of rain for the first, essentially, half of the year. And it was still raining. Mm-hmm. And that 30 inches is impressive enough, but this makes it the wettest start to the year since 1925. And that's on the heels of 2019, which is the second wettest. So they've got a lot of water down there. They've been very, very wet since mid-2018. And as I said, it was still raining.
So they're ahead of last year's pace.
They're ahead of last year's pace, and it was still raining. So I'll get some updated totals for the 1st of June. But again, very, very wet with the attendant problems of flooding, saturated soils, difficulty getting into the fields, all of the stuff that goes with that excess moisture.
Looking at the temperature side, really not much variation from the norm for this time of the year, you tell us.
Right. We had some areas that were a little bit cooler than normal. The Northwest probably leads the charge on that. They were almost 3 degrees cooler than normal. Not surprising given the fact that they were wet and cloudy, and so that held the temperature down. The Southwest Division, on the other side, was about 1 degree warmer than normal. Again, they had more intermittent clouds, and they've been drier, so there's a lot of capacity for those temperatures to warm up during the day and cool down at night. Overall, statewide, we were just about 1 degree cooler than normal. We did have quite a range of temperatures. The warmest spot, again, down in the Southwest, was 97 degrees, getting up close to our summer-like temperatures that we would expect in that region. But the West Central had the cool spot, and that was 38 degrees. So, again, as those frontal systems came through, clear, sunny days, those temperatures will soar, and you get the cloudy, cold north winds behind it, and you'll have those temperatures drop fairly dramatically.
And these are meaningful as we look at those newly planted summer crops, slow to come on, and those cooler readings have something to do with that.
Right. When you have those colder temperatures, you are going to have slower accumulation of the growing degree units, particularly for the warm season crops such as sorghum and cotton in particular. We haven't got a whole lot of sorghum in the ground yet. More in the cotton has been planted. For the corn and the soybeans, again, those cold temperatures aren't helping matters. In areas where you've got saturated soils, that's creating some issues too, where you're not getting good root development. You may have some that it gets drowned out. It really is going to be an issue. The question will be, can those soils drain fast enough before these temperatures warm up, which we'll probably get to next, but we're expecting a warm, dry week for the coming week.
Well, let's talk more in specific about that. How warm and how long will dry weather stick around?
Well, on the warm side, while they give us a good chance for being warmer than normal from the Climate Prediction Center's outlook, they don't tell us how much warmer than normal it can be. Right now, the forecasts are for in the eastern part of the state to see temperatures in the mid-80s, probably be higher out in the western part of the state. The question will be also on the nighttime lows. We've, with the cloudy, damp weather, have not had much daily variation from between the highs and the lows. It's been maybe 5 degrees between the highest temperature of the day and the lowest temperature of the night. On the moisture side of things, the forecast or the outlook is for drier than normal for the next 8 to 14 days. The QPF for the week ending next Friday is for generally less than 1/4 of an inch across the state. Not completely dry, but that is quite a bit less than we would normally see.
Good to visit as always, Mary. Many thanks to you.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. And that is our time for today and the week as well. Our thanks to you for tuning in. Please be back with us on Monday, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.